This is the TRM Atom, and it is still, in 2024, one of the best EDC knives on the market. The TRM Neutron was the knife that first brought Three Rivers manufacturing to prominence in the knife community. It's not their first knife. They've been making them for quite a bit longer. You know, they have a history before anybody really cared, but they started making this one 2020, 2021, some years back in Massachusetts, which is where all their blades are made. Like all their blades, 20 CV, made in the USA, relatively thin stock. And this knife, when it came out, before the ProTech Malibu, before the Demco 8020, there was basically a year where this was the big hyped knife and where TRM knives is a $200 knife retail, $209 in this exact configuration. You can get it up to north of $300 if you get their textured titanium scales, but this knife was the knife that everybody wanted and nobody could get. There are good reasons for that. And as I'll discuss, it's still one of the best performing small EDC knives on the market, and it is an absolute pleasure to carry. What's most impressive though, is that where a lot of the other knives that have gotten hype thrown on them have sort of come and gone in how excellent people think they are, or have been influential but have been surpassed by others that have followed. Great example there is the ProTech Malibu. You know, the ProTech Malibu brought button locks, manual button locks, to prominence within the knife community. Following the ProTech Malibu, I mean, people made button locks before that, but following the ProTech Malibu, tons of people started making button locks. And the fact is, the ProTech Malibu is not nearly as special now as it was back when it was one of the most satisfying and one of really the first manual button lock folders on the market. The TRM Atom, which is a thin, slicey knife with very good ergonomics, led to a pretty significant period where lots of folks were making thin, slicey knives with very good ergonomics. And yet still, after years of imitators, you can't necessarily say the TRM Atom is the best, but it's still one of the best, and it's still an excellent choice for EDC in 2024. So let's start with the blade, because with TRM, the blade is the star of the show. It's a 20 CV, 90 thousandths on the stock, so 0.09 inches. So you're starting with thin stock, and you've got all this space to grind down to the edge. Now, TRM does not grind their blades as thin as they could. Starting with the thin stock with this tall blade, they could get down to a insanely sharp edge, an edge that would be sharp to the point that it would be fragile. They do not do that. This is actually a pretty flat grind, all considered, meaning it's not tapering really aggressively down to that edge. And so this knife, this is still going to be one of the thinnest behind the edge knives in your collection. But when you compare it to, you know, other knives that have, say, thicker stock or have a shorter grind, it's not going to be a complete world-beating amount of sliciness. This is a very slicey knife that, especially for light EDC tasks, does those light EDC tasks well. For tape, for paper, for plant material, for piercing into things, you've got a very fine tip there. This edge is more than sufficient and will glide through most things. And if you put an aggressive edge on it, if you sharpen it in a way that lays back that edge, that you can turn this into a laser beam, and you can make it hyper sharp. But as it comes from TRM, it is just very sharp. But the benefit of this 90,000 stock comes when you use it for things like cutting through cardboard. And that is where the fact that the stock is thinner means you are just pushing a thinner piece of material through whatever you're cutting. And so for any cut where you're dragging that blade through the material, that is where the Atom is going to be noticeably and substantially better than most other blades you are used to using. You know, there are some exceptions, I'll talk about them, but most of the blades most people are used to, this is going to feel like it cuts better than most of them, particularly in those cuts when you're dragging it through the material. And it helps that this blade shape is a very typical drop point. It's a well done drop point. You have a very nice sort of swoopy swedge there. It's very well done. A very nice stone wash. TRM does an excellent stone wash on their knives. It hides pretty much all the machine marks. And the tip, a little bit above the pivot, but almost the whole thing is belly. There isn't really, I mean, this part, it looks pretty flat, but there's actually a little bit of curve the whole way. And even the flat is a little bit of, you know, it's a belly and then it starts to rise a little bit. You don't have any, if I compare this to, say, and it's not a great comparison knife to knife, but like with the PM2, you've got a flat here. That bottom there is very obviously flat. And then it starts to swoop. This here, this Neutron here, I mean, maybe down here, but you start to see even a hint of a curve, even as far back as here. So it really ends up feeling like there's belly through the whole blade. And given the ergonomic lines of this handle and how thin this blade is, which really affords a nice pinch grip here, it's very easy to just drag this whole blade through everything and use it like a kitchen knife, in the sense that it's just the whole knife you can use to cut and to gradually slice through, work that knife through, drag the tip. It just ends up being an insanely useful blade. Not designed to be a hard use blade. Don't use it as a hard use blade because, I mean, this stock is too thin for twisting it into stuff and hacking down a tree and all that. But for anything that it makes reasonable sense to use this blade for, this blade will do it extraordinarily well. And that's most of the reason that people love the Neutron. They love the Neutron because the Neutron gets almost 3 inches of this wonderfully, simply, but wonderfully designed and executed, slicey, basic drop point blade. But to just focus on the blade of the Neutron would be to sell it short and to sell what TRM has done here short. So let's look to these thumb studs. These thumb studs are their older thumb studs, and they have done some newer versions that are closer to Chris Reeve style. And these thumb studs, particularly on the Neutron and Atom, actually work really well. They're rounded on the top, and so if you just skirt off the top, you're going to get no grip. But there's a lip, and a fairly sharp lip, right under that rounded top. And if you go down even a little bit, your thumb will catch the edge of that lip. And the action, it will fly right out. Now it helps that the detent is, actually no, the detent is not that strong. What it is this another knife, I've talked about this in some others, so when you're thinking about overcoming a detent, you're thinking about action. What you're talking about is you're pushing this thumb stud, and you want to push it basically perpendicular at an angle that is perpendicular to the pivot or close to perpendicular to the pivot, and if anything, perpendicular to the pivot and forward. And that's going to apply most of your force in a way that's actually going to open the blade. When the sort of arm between your pivot and your thumb stud here is correct, it takes very little effort to apply a lot of torque around that pivot. And so you get a really snappy, satisfying action that fires out with authority even without a stiff detent to hold it back. I mean, this is a knife that I can very easily fail. This is on phosphor bronze washers, and I can so easily push it out like that. But the second I try to put force on and try to open this, it just pops right out. And it's a combination of this little catch under the thumb stud here and where this thumb stud is placed relative to the pivot, which is darn near perfect. And even though it's got a light detent, that ends up giving it a very satisfying action. So this thumb stud, I have never had an issue with this thumb stud. You can put these O-rings that TRM gives you on there. I find that on the Atom, the O-rings just clutter things. They actually make it harder to get access to this thumb stud here. And frankly, it's easy enough to flip out. I've never seen the need for them. Then we get to the handle. And this handle is a simple, much like the blade, is a simple, well-designed and well-executed blade. This is a simple, well-designed and well-executed handle. These are their flat G10 scales on here. On the Neutron in particular, I prefer the flat G10 scales. 2 reasons for that. 1, there's a very nice peel ply texture on these flat scales. It's a little bit less textured than something from Spyderco, and it gives you just enough grip that your hands feel a little bit more secure when you're grabbing this knife. Because with a neutral handle like this, there's not a lot of contouring that's keeping your hand in place. So you are relying a little bit more on that grip to keep your hands on the knife, stop them from sliding all over. And on top of that, with these scales, the whole knife is quite thin. You know, I'll pull out my Sage, which is another very good small knife. And you can see it's a little bit thinner than the Sage. If I line them up there, it's thinner than the Sage, and the Sage is not a thick knife. I don't think I've got many other good comparisons on the table. The only knife I can think of that might be thinner than this, which I'll bring in that comparison later, is your Chaparral. But even if you compare it to the Chaparral, it's not even thicker than the Chaparral. And the Chaparral is a noticeably thin knife. So with these flat G10 scales, you have a knife that is as thin as the Chaparral. Now, much bigger than the Chaparral, much more capable than the Chaparral, but as thin as the Chaparral, and it feels that way in the pocket. When you fold this up in the pocket, it just slides right in and right out. You know, that profile right there, easy to fit into any pocket. When you get the contoured scales, you lose that grip. They fully sand down the surface of the contoured scales, so the surface of the contoured scales is slippery. And yes, now you can get the lizard skin texture in some of those on there, but I haven't handled all of those, but my experience with textured TRM scales is they still don't have a texture on there. There are, you know, macro textures, but there's no micro texture on those milled scales, and so they can be a little slippery. And on top of that, they're fatter. At their thickest, the contoured scales for the Neutron, this is not true for the Atom, but for the Neutron, at their fattest, the contoured scales will be thicker than the flat scales. So I actually prefer the flat scales on my Atom, because with this neutral handle, when my fingers go over onto that textured grip area there, and then my fingers go onto these chamfers, you got a little flat here and then a chamfer right there, a pretty even little chamfer all the way around there. This just feels super secure in the hand. And it's not because it has dramatic ergonomic lines. It does have a nice little palm swell here, does have a nice little swell for the fingers. You know, I usually find myself gripping my Atom with this front finger up in the choil, up in the blade choil, rather than back here. This feels a little uncomfortable because this is a little thin right here. But gripping it here, this feels secure in the hand, and it's not because of the ergonomic lines of the handle so much as it is the way those chamfers give me anchor points, you know, give points of friction, corners that sit into my hand, and then that texture that my fingers land on gives me something to grip. And so it feels like I've got a bit of grip tape in my hand, and this just feels nice, secure. Same thing when I go up on a pinch grip. When I am pinching here, most of my thumb is still on this textured surface, and so it feels like all my back fingers, my entire back finger here is on this textured surface. And so, by the way, this little cut here, just did it. So if you want to know if the Atom is sharp, yes, I just cut myself with it. This pinch grip here, I've got lots of texture from this handle here. It just feels nice. And you get a bit of something that almost looks like patina there too. This is just hand gook. But I prefer these flat handles, and I think these flat handles bring the best out of this handle design, which is a handle that is designed to be neutral and easy to pick up and carry, and is really using it's not using dramatic ergonomic lines to lock your hand in. It is, in the case of these flat scales, using those chamfers, using that grip there to give you a better grip and a better purchase on the knife in whatever grip you want. And it does work in a lot of different grips. This is a nice half choil here. It's easy to sneak up into that. You can get, you can get all the way up in here if you want to. You can pinch the knife easily, use it like a chef's knife, grab it just between your fingers. You got tons of control. You can go all the way back here. It's just a nice neutral knife. I do think some of those characteristics are lost with the contoured handle. I find with the contoured handles, this gets slippery in the hand. So I don't love those. They're more expensive to boot. Now, one thing that deserves mentioning with TRM is these little screws here. This is their, you can see here, their quick swap scale system. Basically, the way these scales are set up, and these are now nested liner scales, you can remove these scales and swap them to a new material without taking the whole knife apart. Apologies for the car alarm there if you hear that. You can just remove a couple screws and drop another set of scales right on top, which is cool. You know, if you're somebody, and by the way, TRM makes tons of great first-party scales in lots of different materials and colors. They use G10, they use G11, which I've never seen anybody else except them and Wilkins knives use, at least not in a long time. They make carbon fibers, they make woods, they make tech wood, they make micarta, all sorts of stuff. They're relatively reasonably priced, and they're easy to swap in and out. So if you want to change what your Neutron is wearing day to day, occasion to occasion, it takes literally like 45 seconds to swap out the scales. I can't do that right now. I don't have any other Neutron scales because I love these gray G10 scales and I see no reason to have any other set. But if you want to change them, you can very quickly and very easily. Last thing to talk about here is when I was talking about the action before, this liner lock. This is a great liner lock. The lockup is early, but the lockup is secure. You know, if you remember on my rock wall review, I mentioned how on the rock wall, I could push on the blade and it was not perceptible, but you could feel on the rock wall, you could feel that blade deflect a little bit. This one, even though it's a, not a thick lock bar, it's not a thin lock bar, but it's not thick, there's no play, there's no wiggle, and no matter how hard I can maybe get the tiniest bit if I really push, but I've never noticed it before. And I think honestly, it might just be flexing my hand. It certainly feels more secure in its lockup than, it feels as secure as it needs to. This feels as secure as, honestly, like my Spyderco Military, which has a very similar looking and feeling lock bar, very similar lock bar tension, which is not that high. This feels as secure as any liner lock needs to. It's easy to disengage. You've got some nice little teeth here that make it easy to push your finger in and drop it out like that. And again, that thumb stud action is great. And so this is really one of those knives that takes up very little space in your pocket, and the action of having it in your pocket and then pulling it out of your pocket. By the way, this pocket clip, I have an aftermarket clip on it, so I can't talk about the original clip, but the original clip is fine. I bought it with this clip on it. I actually prefer the original, but this is what I've got right now. But the stock clips are great. This is a very easy knife to pull out of your pocket, get your thumb naturally goes where the thumb stud is, get your thumb, pop it out, grab the knife whatever way you need to, do whatever task you need to, cut, drag, pull, slice, whatever, and then you just pop that lock bar in, pop it back. It's a nice smooth action on the close. I usually just close it like that. So, you do your task, you pop it back in, you pop it back into your pocket. And it's just easy to do. It's simple, it's easy, it doesn't get in your way. This is a knife that is simple. It's straightforward. It's basically, if you just think about what does a very good EDC knife need to be? Not something that is trying to be the best EDC knife ever. What does a very good EDC knife need to do? It needs to cut well. This cuts well. It needs to be easy to open. It has a great thumb stud. It needs to be secure. It's got a good liner lock. It needs to be easy to close. It's got a very smooth action. It needs to be nice and comfortable in the hand while still being secure in the hand. This neutral handle with these scales does that well. And preferably it needs to be thin and unobtrusive in the pocket. You've got a knife that is as thin as the Chaparral and 2.5 ounces. That is certainly as thin and unobtrusive as anything in this size range. There might be some things that match it. There's nothing that I know of that beats it. And so the fact is, the TRM Neutron has been out for a couple years now, and there are knives that are more flashy, there are knives that are more fun, and there are knives that are better in certain aspects. I really like the way the mini Ritter Hogue. I love the ergonomics on the handle, and I find the edge on that one particularly impressive. It's got that fidgety liner lock action. It's great. The Chaparral, which I talked about not too long ago, is, a slicey little beast, but honestly, it does pretty much the same things the Neutron does, just in a smaller package. It's not even thinner, it's just smaller. The Tactile Rockwell gives you a 3-inch knife with a robust blade and fidget factor, but it's more different than it is better. You know, the Native, more robust, but it's different. The Neutron isn't trying to be robust like the Native. It's trying to be small in the pocket and slicey, and it is smaller in the pocket and slicier than the Native. And so there are knives that are different than the Neutron 2, but there's no knife that I can think of that is better than the Neutron 2. And certainly no knife at $200 made in the USA that is better than the Neutron 2. And that was true when it came out, and that remains true today. And so the Neutron 2 by this point is really starting to look in the same sort of class as something like, you know, your small Sebenza. The small Sebenza is a knife that somewhat notoriously has changed very little for a very long time. And that's because the small Sebenza is just about perfect. My Sebenza review will come up at some point, but I believe the small Sebenza is the best 3-inch knife on the market still. But the Neutron has not changed because it doesn't need to change, because it remains one of the best things you can get. And particularly if you're looking for a $200 knife, and you're looking for a $200 EDC knife and something that you can just put in your pocket that will do everything you need for EDC, that will be fun to use, that has a fun and satisfying action, that is secure in the hand, and also happens to be made in the USA, you're not going to do better. And even if you ditch the made in the USA criteria, I'm not sure you could do better, even going overseas. It's a great knife. It has dulled to no degree over time, and so still, even though it is no longer the new kid on the block, and even though it no longer sells out every single time they get posted, and even though these, you know, now sell for below retail on secondary rather than above retail, that doesn't mean it's any less exceptional, and that doesn't mean you should be any less excited to put one into your collection. The TRM Neutron remains a great knife, and you should really give it a look. Hope this was a good use of your time, and I will see you again soon.